At the end of the year, I sent out an email to everyone who had been engaging with my newsletter, and I asked one question. What's a topic you really want to see me address in a YouTube video that you haven't heard me cover before? And the top answer was overwhelming. Edges. How do I paint them? How do I know when to soften them? What about when to lose them? How do you control edges without overblending? If you're like these painters, you've had the experience where you finished a painting and gotten it totally accurate, but something looks, uncanny or forced or stiff, not lifelike. But then you might turn around and look at a loose oil portrait, something by Sargent, or like this incredible piece by Francis Bell, and say, well, that doesn't look as precise, but somehow it feels more lifelike. So the question becomes, how can a painting that's technically less precise feel more real than a perfect copy that we see in a photograph? The answer isn't color, it isn't brush confidence, it isn't even drawing. The answer is edges. But to understand why edges matter this much, we have to talk about something painters almost never question: how we actually see. As I talk about edges, I've chosen this painting to show you today because this is one where I really deliberately play with the edges that I have in this piece. So as I talk about the different principles guiding whether an edge should be hard versus soft versus lost in this video, and the rationale behind them, notice where that's showing up in this particular piece and how it allows this piece to come to life. So before we talk about how our eye perceives edges in real life, we need to talk about why photographs get us almost all the way to lifelike, but just miss the mark. See, a camera records information in a very specific way. It locks its focus. It treats every edge according to how far away each object in frame is away from the focus area. And because of that, it can look incredibly convincing. But if a camera is so accurate, why doesn't copying what the camera sees create a totally convincing painting? And that is because accuracy and perception are not the same thing. A camera records data. Your brain works in an entirely different way. Most people assume that, like a camera, we see everything pretty clearly all at once. But that's not actually true. In reality, the area of your vision that sees sharp detail and full color is actually extremely small. It's roughly 1 to 2 degrees of your entire visual field, which is about the size of your thumb held out at arm's length. Everything outside of that is lower resolution, it is less color sensitive, and it appears softer. So you might have heard me say that and want to call BS and say like, okay, if that were true, I think I would notice. But we don't notice that because your eyes are scanning rapidly and imperceptibly over the entire visual field, and your brain is stitching together a believable image. It feels like we're seeing everything all at once, but it's actually an illusion that our brain is crafting for us so that we can navigate through the world without stumbling over terrain or miss the tiger that might be hiding in the brush. So, what does this tell us about painting? Well, a painting doesn't have to capture everything. In order to feel lifelike, it simply has to feel like human visual perception. That means we can't just copy what the camera sees. We have to hack the visual system, and edges are one of the most powerful ways to do that. So, how do we hack it? And what exactly do edges do that creates this effect? Well, an edge is simply the boundary between two shapes of color or value. An edge can occur where the boundary of your subject's head meets the background. But an edge can also occur internally. It can be where the nasolabial fold in the nose meets with the rest of the cheek. It can be the boundary between an area of the face that's in the light and an area of the face that is in shadow. But one important thing to note is that not all edges are equal. They can be hard, they can be soft, or they can be lost. Now, you might have heard other descriptors like a firm edge, but just for the sake of simplicity, I think it's appropriate to think of these as being in these three primary buckets. Now, going back to a photograph, many edges default to being relatively hard or very evenly focused. So we might get softer edges farther away from the focal point, but it happens in a very even way. And depending on the photograph, we still might wind up with something where everything feels very hard edged. But in human vision, this just doesn't happen. Edges are constantly changing based on our focus, where we have set our attention, whether that object is moving, how the light is interacting with that object, and also just the depth of that object. How far back in space is it relative to us? So when painters treat all of our edges the same, the painting starts to feel, well, kind of artificial, even if everything else is right. And the problem is that it feels just right enough that it's actually difficult to pinpoint a lot of the time that the edges are the problem. This is why a common mistake painters make is trying to be, quote, consistent. So consistent blending, consistent sharpness, consistent softness. But the human eye isn't consistent. It is selective. And when every edge is treated with equal importance, the painting doesn't really have anywhere to breathe. So the real question isn't, how do I stop over blending my edges? Or how do I stop making all of my edges so hard? The question is, which edges deserve attention and which ones should disappear? Let's go back to this incredible Frances Bell painting. It won the Draper Grand Prize at Portrait Society last year, and this painting of hers is a personal favorite of mine. I cannot seem to stop studying it, and I love dissecting it. If you really look at this piece, you'll notice something immediately. The edges don't just go from hard to soft to lost in a predictable pattern. It doesn't get boring. The edges don't become predictable. They also aren't random either. Instead, the edges seem to progress in a sort of a rhythm. So they're hard edges that really grab your attention, and then soft edges that allow your eye to just kind of drift over a section without thinking too hard about it, without, getting distracted by that area. And then there are these lost edges that allow one form to just kind of melt into one another. And we almost stop recognizing those distinctions between shapes right away because of it. And as a result, those shapes actually become less important to us. So when I look at this painting and I look for some of the harder edges, aka the places where our eye should really be lingering and focusing, I notice a lot of edges in her face itself. We have a lot of crisp edges in her glasses, in the highlights in those glasses, in her eyes, and just how much contrast there is between this eye that is in the light and the rest of the light side of her face. I look at the edges at her hairline. Specifically, I look a little bit lower. I look around this ear that's in the light, and I notice how we have these harder edges where we see her hair meeting her face, whether it's at the temple or whether it's at the back of her jaw, and it's helping to actually really give shape to the face. And because there are all these relatively hard edges in the face itself, I linger quite a bit on her face. Now, this makes sense. This piece is a portrait first and foremost, so naturally we want to create a lot of visual interest in the face itself. But what about once we move away from the face? Where are some other places where some hard edges actually really stand out and our attention will naturally follow? Well, the next place that I really notice some hard edges are actually in the buttons that run down her vest. And funnily enough, these buttons actually kind of guide the eye directly from the center of the face, and it points it right at that shiny, hard-edged watch that is on her wrist. I think that's such a cool design choice. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about why it really makes sense for the buttons or the watch to have harder edges in them. But for right now, just notice that these hard-edged areas are actually doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of directing your eye. At Portrait Society, I had someone come up to me and say, well, at the end of the day, isn't loose painterly brushwork just kind of an arbitrary stylistic decision that's individual to each artist? Isn't it kind of futile to think that we can just teach ourselves to paint like Sargent when a lot of that just came from his intuition and his unique style? And the answer is, when you really understand the level of thought that went into their edge control and design, you realize it's not actually arbitrary. In order for us to really master our craft, we're gonna make kind of similar decisions in how we control edges as well. Now, this artist did have a point. It will be a little bit different for everybody, but we tend to follow the same principles because at the end of the day, we want our paintings to in some way mimic human perception. All right, so we've talked about hard edges. Now let's take a look at some areas where we have lost edges. And right away, I'm actually looking at this shadow side of her face and also the shadow shoulder. And I'm noticing how her hair is entirely melting into this vertical stripe on the wallpaper behind her, and how that is melting in to the top of her vest. What this signals to us is, hey, these distinctions aren't important. You don't need to be lingering on this area of the hair or this area of the vest. We can allow all of these things to simplify down into what is essentially one unified shape. We see this again with the dark of her pant leg disappearing into another vertical stripe. And I'm sure if you really zoom in on this piece, you will see this kind of repeated over and over. For instance, even if I look at her right shoulder that is in the light, there's this little tiny moment right at the peak of her shoulder where the light of her blouse gets completely lost into the lighter stripe of that background wallpaper. So if we combine what we're noticing about hard edges with where we're noticing lost edges, there's kind of this middle ground of softened edges, places where the boundary is clear, but it doesn't really call our attention to it. For me, as I look at this shirt sleeve that is in the light, I actually see soft edges kind of throughout the vertical line of this sleeve. There's a softened edge where the light of her sleeve meets the dark of the wallpaper stripe. And then she actually inserts this little bit of a cast shadow right at her shoulder to create a softened edge rather than a lost edge as her arm meets the shoulder. And it's set up against this lighter part of the wallpaper. What I think makes this piece so brilliant and so instructive when it comes to edges is that she's actually operating in this fairly, it's not a predictable rhythm, but it is really interesting rhythm of hard, lost, and soft edges. We don't just have huge streaks of the same kind of edge. If it's starting to get too monotonous, she breaks it up with a lost edge the way she does just at the apex of that shoulder. Or if you follow the line of her shoulder right to where it meets the neck, you'll notice that she has very clearly and deliberately softened this edge of the neckline of her vest and where it meets the lighter part of the wall behind her. We can see where she ends and where the wallpaper begins, but she does it in a way where the edge isn't too crisp. It doesn't become distracting. What's left is that she's left in just enough hard edges and potentially soft edges as well, so that we really understand exactly where her outline is. We don't just have no idea where she ends and the background begins. We have enough context from our soft and hard edges to really show us that. And so the lost edges, what they're really doing is kind of functioning the way that our eyes and our brains naturally do. We get some limited information and then we fill in the gaps. And the way she is painted invites our minds to fill in the gaps the way they actually do in real life. It is just such a masterclass in the design of an image and how to control your edges to make something feel incredibly lifelike, even when you look at this piece and say, well, The edge wouldn't possibly look like that in real life though. So how does it feel so real? This is why. Because she understands how the human eye works and is allowing her painting to emulate that. So this is usually the moment that painters start looking for a formula. Put your hard edges here, your soft edges there, lost edges in the background. And I get why, especially when looking at a painting so impressive as this one. There's so much happening here. I don't want to have 100 rules just to navigate with regard to edges. I want things to be simple. But that kind of turns edges into just another checkbox, like saying, oh, use the rule of thirds, or all right, cool light, warm shadows. And that doesn't really create a style. In fact, in my experience working with hundreds of painters, I see so many more painters get really hung up on these maxims than they actually get any benefit out of them. So what actually dictates what needs to be happening with an edge is its context. It isn't just a rule, it's not a formula, and it's not like a preference or a habit from you as an artist either. Edges are the result of circumstances, multiple ones happening at the same time. So instead of asking, should this edge be hard or soft, the better question is, what's happening here? So let's break that down. If a form, a 3D object, is turning away from you gradually and softly, think like a cheek or a forearm or the curve of a jaw, that edge will naturally soften. Now, if a form turns abruptly, like the edge of a collar or the rim of a glass or a sharp plane change, that edge is going to read harder. So you're not inventing edges arbitrarily, you're responding to the geometry of the form in front of you. As like a PS here, if you've ever painted a still life and you've had something like oranges or apples in your still life, and for some reason it kind of looks like you just cut and pasted your fruit into the still life, it is usually because you painted that spherical fruit all with hard edges, and something about that just doesn't feel quite lifelike. Oftentimes, if we soften the edges of fruit in a still life, especially like spherical fruit, like I said, it actually strangely becomes more believable, more lifelike. But this doesn't just apply to very simple spheres like an orange. We see this in our faces. We even see this in things like landscapes. Think about the canopy of a tree, for instance. But form isn't the only thing that determines what an edge should actually be. So next we need to talk about color and value relationships. So edges soften when adjacent shapes are close to one another in color or in value. And then those edges sharpen when the contrast increases. Again, whether that's value contrast or color contrast. That's why the nose against a cheek often melt together, while a jaw against a neck that's in shadow will snap into focus. You didn't just decide to soften or sharpen it. The value relationships already did that for you. In the example of the nose against the cheek, usually these are pretty much the same color and the same value. So it kind of makes sense for them to be able to run together. But in the example of the jaw next to the neck that's in shadow, well, these two areas have very different values, and you could probably argue in a lot of cases that the color is different as well. And the more different these values and or colors, the harder of an edge you will naturally find there. All right, next we need to talk about surface and texture. So some materials refuse to have clean edges, and some materials really always want to have hard edges. So the materials that refuse to have clean edges are typically things like hair, fur, feathers, a lot of fabrics and textiles, and things like foliage. Trying to force razor-sharp edges onto those surfaces almost always makes a painting feel photographic or stiff. On the other hand, surfaces like polished metal, glass, or polished stone can support much harder edges, even if they're fairly low contrast. If you've ever painted something like a polished bit of stone or polished glass and you softened your edges, you might have noticed that it makes the surface look frosted. And that is because the edges are actually defined by that surface texture, showing that value and form alone aren't determining what the edge should really be. This is part of why in Frances's painting, we see these really hard edges when we look at the buttons of her vest or the watch that she's wearing. It's because in the case of the buttons, these are probably a polished, shiny plastic. And then in the case of her watch, we have a polished metal. Now, let's talk about light, because this is a big one. So hard, direct light creates harder edges. Diffuse light, so think like overcast lighting, a cloudy day, north light, reflected light, these kinds of light sources often soften edges dramatically. Think about the difference between a summer's day at noon and the kind of shadows that are created on that day versus an overcast winter day. Same subject, but completely different edge behavior. So if you're painting soft light but using hard edges everywhere, the painting is going to feel wrong, even if the drawing is perfect. Same goes in the opposite scenario. If you are painting a really bright summer's day, but you are allowing too many of your edges to become soft. And atmosphere matters too. So things like humidity, fog, dust, haze, distance, all of these scatter the light and soften your edges. This is why background forms in landscapes and even portraits can lose edges without disappearing, and why a landscape where mountains that are off in the distance are painted in a way that feels too hard can often distract from the image and make it somehow feel less believable. Finally, we come to motion. If something is moving and you paint it with crisp, static edges, it instantly reads as photographic. Lost and soft edges are one of the most powerful ways to suggest motion without exactly blurring anything. That's why painters like Sargent or Sorolla, or even modern painters like David Shevlino, their pieces feel so kinetic and so alive. It's all down to how they use edges to really suggest this experience of motion. Edges are doing the work here. And it doesn't just apply to things in motion. It can also apply to things that are about to burst into motion. So one of the most common kind of pitfalls that the painters I help run into with portraits is that they can paint the portrait perfectly, but somehow the lips will look like they have been lip lined to death. Like it just doesn't look believable. And the reason is that the lips are the most mobile part of our face. Think about it. I mean, you don't move your nose the same way you can move your lips. Even your eyes, like our eyes just blink. That's kind of it. But our mouth is responsible for such a large percentage of human communication, and the amount of sounds it needs to be able to create in a typical language is innumerable. And so to paint a lip with a really hard edge suggests that it's fixed in the way that our nose is. In order to paint lips that genuinely feel lifelike, if we soften those edges just a little bit, even if we could harden our eye on those lips and see harder edges than we think we need to paint, if we just soften them a little bit, typically, suddenly they actually feel lifelike the way we experience them in the real world. So please, if you take anything out of this video, soften the lips in your portraits. It'll make you so much happier with your work. All right, at this point in this video, you might be thinking, okay, that all makes sense, but you worry that when you sit down to paint, you might just be thinking, well, what does this actually look like when I'm holding the brush and having to make these decisions? Because this is a lot to juggle mentally. Now, I will tell you there's good news. Anytime you are expanding your skill set, you will have to stretch yourself mentally. It's like you are training a new muscle. The more you actually practice this, the more you will find these edge decisions become automatic and don't require as much brain power as they will right now. But there is one more layer of this. Just because you will start to understand what edges to put down, that doesn't mean you'll know how to put them down in a way that feels congruent with your style. Or in other words, understanding why an edge might soften or harden doesn't automatically tell you how to soften or harden it. And that's where paintings can start to feel generic. If all you have is a concept of soften here, lose there, the painting can start to feel mechanical. You understand why edges matter, you understand how they mimic perception, you understand why they make a painting feel alive. But if you don't know what edge-making brushstrokes should look like for your goal style of painting, well, all of this stays kind of conceptual and abstract. It turns into another set of rules you're trying to apply instead of a language you're fluent in. Like you're following a formula instead of building your voice. And that's why so many painters learn about edges, but still don't feel like their work has a clear identity. So if you've listened to this and you know you want to play with edges more in your paintings, but you want to make sure it's actually in service of your artistic voice, I've made a free workbook that walks you through exactly how to discover and refine your signature style of oil painting. And that includes understanding what the marks you want to make look like, so that when it comes to softening or hardening an edge, you know exactly what that looks like for you specifically. It helps you take the framework that we talked about today and translate this into something that is personal and specific, because no two painters actually apply these ideas in the same way. And as a bonus, in my next video, I'll show you how I took this exact framework, translated it into my own mark-making language, and used it to build a style that went on to win one of the top awards an oil painter can receive. If you want your edges and brushwork to seriously level up your art, watch that video next.